My goodness.
with a
the media for most of its existence up until about 1990, at least
Elon
from about
Musk
1930s
buying
until the
Twitter. We'll start from the beginning there. Well, actually, Quebec mosque shooting. I don't even know anything about
I'm not
it. I
gonna
must have tuned out.
I'm not going to suggest that that was Joe Biden's fault, because it's not Joe Biden's fault. I mean, we can play this game all day long, and I find that the people who are most intensely focused on playing this game are people who tend to oppose the politics of the person, as opposed to actually believing sincerely
I'm trying
that this
for
has
it,
driven
Shadows.
somebody into the arms of
I'm doing
the
best
god
I
of violence.
can over here.
But
Well, I don't know what's
I have
going on, though.
4.7 million
Did
Twitter
some
followers.
updates,
I
so
have
hopefully that'll help.
8 million Facebook followers. I have 5 million YouTube followers. I would imagine that some of them are people who are violent. I would imagine that some of them are people who do evil things or want to do evil things.
Upset because
And
Ben,
I wish that there were a wand that we could wave that would prevent those people from deliberately or mistakenly misinterpreting things as a call to violence. It's just a negative byproduct of the fact that you can reach a lot of people. And so, you know, if somebody could point me to the comment that I suppose, quote unquote, drove somebody to go and literally murder human beings, then I would appreciate it, so I could talk about the comment. But I don't, mainly because I just think that if we remove agency from individuals, and if we blame broad-scale political rhetoric for every act of violence, we're not going to, the people who are going to pay the price are actually the general population, because free speech will go away. If the idea is that things that we say could drive somebody who is unbalanced to go do something evil, the necessary byproduct is hate. Is that speech is a form of hate. Hate is a form of violence. Speech is a form of violence. Speech needs to be curbed. And that to me is deeply disturbing.
So definitely that man, that 27-year-old man, is the only one responsible for the evil he did. But what if he and others like him are not nutcases? What if they're people with pain, with anger in their heart? What would you say to them? You are exceptionally influential, and other people like you that speak passionately about ideas. What do you think is your opportunity to alleviate the hate in their heart?
If we're speaking about people who aren't mentally ill and people who are just misguided, I'd say to him the thing that I said to every other young man in the country: you need to find meaning and purpose in forming connections that actually matter, in a belief system that actually promotes general prosperity and promotes helping other people. And this is why, you know, the message that I most commonly say to young men is it's time for you to grow up, mature, get a job, get married, have a family, take care of the people around you, become a useful part of your community. I've never, at any point in my entire career, suggested violence as a resort to political issues. I mean, the whole point of having a political conversation is that it's a conversation. If I didn't think that it were worth trying to convince people of my point of view, I wouldn't do what I do for a living.
So violence doesn't solve it.
No, it doesn't.
There's an off chance.
As if this wasn't already a difficult conversation. Let me ask about Ilhan Omar. You've called out her criticism of Israel policies as anti-Semitic. Is there a difference between criticizing a race of people, like the Jews, and criticizing the policies of a nation, like Israel?
Of course. I criticize the policies of Israel on a fairly regular basis. I would assume from a different angle than Ilhan Omar does. But yeah, I mean, I criticize the policies of a wide variety of states. And to take an example, I mean, I've criticized Israel's policy in giving control of the Temple Mount to the Islamic Waqf, which effectively prevents anybody except for Muslims from praying up there. I've also criticized the Israeli government for their COVID crackdown. I mean, you can criticize the policies of any government, but that's not what Ilhan Omar does. Ilhan Omar doesn't actually believe that there should be a state of Israel. She believes that Zionism is racism and that the existence of a Jewish state in Israel is, in and of itself, the great sin. That is a statement she would make about no other people in no other land. She would not say that the French don't deserve a state for the French. She wouldn't say that Somalis wouldn't deserve a state in Somalia. She wouldn't say that Germans don't deserve a state in Germany. She wouldn't say for the 50-plus Islamic states that exist across the world that they don't deserve states of their own. It is only the Jewish state that has fallen under her significant scrutiny. And she also promulgates lies about one specific state in the form of suggesting, for example, that Israel is an apartheid state, which it is most eminently not, considering that the last unity government in Israel included an Arab party, that there are Arabs who sit on the Israeli Supreme Court, and all the rest. And then beyond that, obviously, she's engaged in some of the same sort of anti-Semitic tropes that you heard from Ye, right? The stuff about it's all about the Benjamins, that American support for Israel is all about the Benjamins. And she's had to be chided by members of her own party about this sort of stuff before.
Can you empathize with the plight of Palestinian people?
Nope.
Absolutely. I mean, I some of the uglier things that I've ever said in my career are things that I said very early on when I was 17, 18, 19. I started writing a syndicated column when I was 17. I'm now 38. So virtually all the dumb things, I'd say virtually all, many of the dumb things, the plurality of the dumb things that I've said came from the ages of, I would say, 17 to maybe 23. And they are rooted, again, in sloppy thinking. I feel terrible for people who have lived under the thumb and currently live under the thumb of Hamas, which is an actual terrorist group, or the Palestinian Authority, which is a corrupt oligarchy that steals money from its people and leaves them in misery, or Islamic Jihad, which is an actual terrorist group. And the basic rule for the region, in my view, is if these groups were willing to make peace with Israel, they would have a state literally tomorrow. And if they are not, then there will be no peace. And it really is that simple. If Israel... The formula it's typically used has become a bit of a bumper sticker, but it happens to be factually correct. If the Palestinians put down their guns tomorrow, there would be a state. If the Israelis put down their guns, there would be no Israel.
You get attacked a lot on the internet.
Oh, yeah.
I gotta ask you about your own psychology.
Is that better?
How do you not let that break you mentally? And how do you avoid letting that lead to a resentment of the groups that attack you?
I mean, there are a few sort of practical things that I've done. So, for example, I would say that 4 years ago, Twitter was all-consuming. Twitter is an ego machine, especially the notifications button, right? The notifications button is just people talking about you all the time, and the normal human tendency is, wow,
I can turn down the wow a little bit.
See what they're saying about me, which is a recipe for insanity. So, my wife actually said, Twitter is making your life miserable. You need to take it off your phone. So Twitter is not on my phone. If I want to log onto Twitter, I have to go onto my computer and I have to make the conscious decision to go onto Twitter and then take a look at what's going on.
I could just imagine you like there's a computer in the basement, you descend into the check Twitter.
That's pretty much
in
it.
the darkness.
If you look at when I actually tweet, it's generally like in the run-up to recording my show or when I'm prepping for my show later in the afternoon, for example.
That doesn't affect you negatively mentally, like put you in a bad mental space?
Not particularly if it's restricted to sort of what's being watched. Now, I will say that I think the most important thing is you have to surround yourself with a group of people who you trust enough to make serious critiques of you when you're doing something wrong, but also you know that they have your best interests at heart. Because the internet is filled with people who don't have your best interests at heart, who hate your gods, and so you can't really take those critiques seriously or it does wreck you. And
right, well, how's the sound
the world
now?
is also filled with sycophants, right? The more successful you become, there are a lot of people who will tell you you're always doing the right thing. I'm very lucky. I got married when I was 24, my wife was 20, so she's known me long before I was famous or wealthy or anything. And so she's a good sounding board. I have a family that's willing to call me out on my bullshit, as you talked to Ye about. I have friends who are able to do that. I try to have open lines of communications with people who I believe have my best interest at heart. But one of the sort of conditions of being friends is that when you see me do something wrong, I'd like for people to let me know that so I can correct it. I don't want to leave bad impressions out there.
The sad thing about the internet, just looking at the critiques you get, I see very few critiques from people that actually want you to succeed, want you to grow. I mean, they're very, they're not sophisticated. They're just
insincere flattery.
I don't know. They're cruel.
Very good.
The critiques are just, it's not actual critiques. It's just cruelty.
And that's most of Twitter. I mean, as I said, Twitter is a place to smack and be smacked. And anybody who uses Twitter for an intellectual conversation, I think, is engaging in category error.
I use it to spread love. I think it's still
You're
possible.
the only one. It's you and no one else, my friend.
All right. Well, on that topic, what do you think about Elon buying Twitter? What do you like? What are you hopeful on that front? What would you like to see Twitter improve?
So, I'm very hopeful about Elon buying Twitter. I mean, I think that Elon is significantly more transparent than what has taken place up till now. He seems committed to the idea that he's going to broaden the Overton window to allow for conversations that simply were banned before, everything ranging from efficacy of masks with regard to COVID to whether men can become women and all the rest. A lot of things that would get you banned on Twitter before without any sort of real explanation. It seems like he's dedicated to at least explaining what the standards are going to be and being broader in allowing a variety of perspectives.
Man, Ben's still talking about all this fucking shit.
I think that's also why people are freaking out. I think the
tuned
kind
out.
of wailing and gnashing of teeth and
I was just
wearing
like,
sackcloth
I
and ash
can't
by so many members of the legacy media. I think a lot of that is because Twitter essentially was an oligarchy in which certain perspectives were allowed and certain perspectives just were not. And that was part of a broader social media reimposed oligarchy in the aftermath of 2017. So in order for to really understand, I think, what it means for Elon to take over Twitter, I think that we have to take a look at sort of the history of media in the United States in 2 minutes or less. The United States, the media, for most of its existence up until about 1990, at least from about 1930s until the 1990s, virtually all media was 3 major television networks, a couple major newspapers, and the wire services. Everybody had a local newspaper with some wire services that basically did all the foreign policy and all the national policy. McClatchy, Reuters, AP, AFP, etc. So that monopoly or oligopoly existed until the rise of the internet. There were sort of pokes at it and talk radio and Fox News, but there certainly was not this plethora of sources. Then the internet explodes, and all of a sudden you can get news everywhere. And the way that people are accessing that news is, you're, I believe, significantly younger than I am, but we used to do this thing called bookmarking, where you would bookmark a series of websites and then you would visit them every morning. And then social media came up. And
just on AOL or?
Yeah, exactly. You had the dial-up, and it was actually a can connected to a string, and you'd actually just go
snarky.
And
I remember one time
then,
he said he was like,
there
I
came a
am
point
an
where social
admitted
media
member
arose.
of the Smug
And social
Club.
media was sort of a boon for everybody because you no longer had to bookmark anything. You just followed your favorite accounts, and all of them would pop up. And you follow everything on Facebook, and it would all pop up, and it was all centralized. And for a while, everybody was super happy because this was the brand new wave of the future. It made everything super easy. Suddenly, outlets like mine were able to see new eyeballs because it was all centralized in one place, right? You didn't have to do it through Google optimization. You could now just put it on Facebook, and so many eyeballs were on Facebook, you'd get more traffic. And everybody seemed pretty happy with this arrangement until precisely the moment Donald Trump became president. At that point, then the sort of pre-existing supposition of a lot of the powers that be, which was Democrats are going to continue winning from here on out, so we can sort of use these social media platforms as ways to push our information and still allow for there to be other information out there.
Here.
The immediate response was, we need to reestablish this siphoning of information. It was misinformation and disinformation that won Donald Trump the election. We need to pressure the social media companies to start cracking down on misinformation and disinformation. And actually see this
just throwing out
in
all
the historical record. You can see how Jack Dorsey's talk about free speech shifted from about 2015 to about 2018. You can see Mark Zuckerberg gave a speech at Georgetown in 2018, which he talked about free speech and its value. By 2019, he was going in front of Congress talking about how he was responsible for the stuff that was on Facebook, which is not true. He's not responsible for the stuff on Facebook, right? It's a platform. Is AT&T responsible for the stuff you say on your phone? The answer is typically no. So when that happened, all of these, because all the eyeballs had now been centralized in these social media sites, they were able to suddenly control what you could see and what you could not see. And the most obvious example was obviously leading up to 2020, the election, the killing of the Hunter Biden story is a great example of this. And so Elon coming in and taking over one of the social media services and saying, I'm not playing by your rules, right? There's not going to be this sort of group of people in the halls of power who are going to decide what we can see and hear. Instead, I'm going to let and flowers bloom. There will be limits, but it's going to be on a more case-by-case basis. We're going to allow perspectives that are mainstream, but maybe not mainstream in the halls of academia or in the halls of media. Let those be said. I think it's a really good thing. Now, that comes with, some responsibilities on Elon's personal part, which would be, to be, for example, I think more responsible in dissemination of information himself sometimes, right? Like he got himself in trouble the other day for tweeting out that story about Paul Pelosi that was speculative and untrue. And I don't think what he did is, horrific. He deleted it when he found out that it was false. But and that's actually free speech working, right? He said something wrong, people ripped into him, he realized he was wrong and he deleted it, which seems to me a better solution than preemptively banning content, which only raises more questions than it actually stops. With that said, as the face of responsible free speech, and that's sort of what he's pitching at Twitter, he, I think, should enact that himself and be a little more careful in the stuff that he tweets out.
Well, that's a tricky balance. The reason a lot of people are freaking out is because, one, he's putting his thumb on the scale by saying he is more likely to vote Republican. He's showing himself to be center-right, and sort of just having a political opinion versus being this amorphous thing that doesn't have.
I wasn't paying attention.
I think if I were to guess, I haven't talked to him about it, but if I were to guess, he's sending a kind of signal that's important for the Twitter, the company itself, because if we're being honest, most of the employees are left-leaning, so you have to kind of send a signal that, like a resisting mechanism, to say like, since most of the employees are left, it's good for Elon to be more right, to balance out the way the actual engineering is done, to say we're not going to do any kind of activism inside the engineering. If I were to guess, that's kind of the effective aspect of that mechanism. And the other one, by posting the Pelosi thing, is probably to expand the Overton window, like saying we can play, we could post stuff, we could post conspiracy theories, and then through discourse figure out what is and isn't true.
Yeah, again, like I say, I mean, I think that is a better mechanism in action than what it was before. I just think it gave people who hate his guts the opening to kind of slap him for no reason. But I can see the strategy of it for sure. And I think that the general idea that he's kind of pushing right where the company had pushed left before, I think that there is actually unilateral polarization right now in politics, at least with regard to social media, in which one side basically says the solution to disinformation is to shut down free speech from the other side, and the other side is basically like people like me are saying the solution to disinformation is to let 1,000, like I'd rather have people on the left also being able to put out stuff that I disagree with than for there to be anybody who's sort of in charge of these social media platforms and using them as editorial sites. I mean, they're plenty. I'm not criticizing MSNBC for not putting on right-wing opinions. I mean, that's fine. I run a conservative site. I'm not going to put up left-wing opinions on a wide variety of issues because we are a conservative site. But if you pitch yourself as a platform, that's a different thing. If you pitch yourself as the town square, as Elon likes to call it, then I think Elon has a better idea of that than many of the former employees did, especially now that we have that report from The Intercept suggesting that there are people from Twitter working with DHS to monitor quote-unquote disinformation, and being rather vague about what disinformation meant.
Yeah, I don't think activism has a place in what is fundamentally an engineering company.
We're just getting their ass kicked.
Like the people inside the company should not be putting a thumb on the scale of what is and isn't allowed. You should create a mechanism for the people to decide what is and isn't allowed. Do you think Trump should have been removed from Twitter? Should his account be restored?
His account should be restored. And this is coming from somebody who really dislikes an enormous number of Donald Trump's tweets. Again, he's a very important political personage. Even if he weren't, I don't think that he should be banned from Twitter or Facebook in coordinated fashion. And by the way, I hold that opinion about people who I think are far worse than Donald Trump. Right? Everyone knows I'm not an Alex Jones guy. I don't like Alex Jones. I think Alex Jones pervades.
You think Alex should be back on Twitter?
I do, actually, because I think that there are plenty of people who are willing
Has Alex
to
ever been on
say
Lex's
that
show?
what he's saying is wrong. And I'm not a big fan of this idea that because people I disagree with, and people who have personally targeted me, by the way, I mean, Alex Jones has said some things about me personally that I'm not real fond of.
Dang it, whatever.
Well, we're not besties. No, it turns out, yeah. All I've said is I don't really enjoy his show. He said some other stuff about the Antichrist and such, but that's a bit of a different thing, I suppose. Even so,
yeah.
I'm just not a big fan of this idea. Like, I've defended people who have really gone after
Good old
me
Alex.
on a personal level, have targeted me. That the town square is online. Banning people from the town square is unpersoning them. Unless you violated a criminal statute, you should not be unpersoned in American society, as a general rule. That doesn't mean that companies that are not platforms don't have the ability to respond to you. I think Adidas is right to terminate.
All right, well that was stupid.
But Twitter ain't Adidas.
So the way your stance on free speech, to the degree it's possible to achieve on a platform like Twitter, is you fight bad speech with more speech, with better speech. And that's so if Alex Jones and Trump is allowed back on in the coming months and years leading up to the 2024 election, you think that's going to make for a better world in the long term?
I think that on the principle that people should be allowed to do this, and the alternative being a group of thought bosses telling us what we can and cannot see, yes. So I think in the short term, it's going to mean a lot of things that I don't like very much. Sure, them's the cost of doing business. Like I think that one of the costs of freedom is people doing things that I don't particularly like, and I would prefer the freedom with all the stuff I don't like than not the freedom.
Let me linger on the love a little bit. You and a lot of people are pretty snarky on Twitter. Sometimes
A
to
law
the
of
point
large
of mockery,
numbers
derision,
as
even
your...
a bit of, if I were to say, bad faith in the kind of
Sample
mockery.
size increases.
And you see it as a war. Like I disagree with both you and
Your
Elon on this.
sample
Elon sees Twitter as a war zone, or at least has saw it that way in the past. Have you ever considered being nicer on Twitter? Like as a voice that a lot of people look up to. That if Ben Shapiro becomes a little bit more about love, that's going to inspire a lot of people, or no? Is it just too fun for you?
The answer is yes. Sure, it's occurred to me. Let's put it this way: there are a lot of tweets that actually don't go out that I delete. I will say that Twitter's new function, that 30-second function, is a friend of mine. Every so often, I'll tweet something and I'll think about it in a second. I'm like, do I need to say this? Probably not.
Can you make a book published after you pass away of all the tweets that you didn't send?
Oh no, my kids are still going to be around. I hope so. That's the legacy. But yeah, I mean, sure. The answer is yes, and this is a good piece of what we'd call in Orthodox Judaism musar.
I know this
It's like they give you
spell
musar
really
schmooze
does
right
take
now. This is
fucking
like the kind of be a better person stuff. I agree with you. And yeah, I will say that Twitter is sometimes too much fun. I try to be at least, if not even-handed, then equal opportunity in my direction.
I guess if you were
I remember that during the 2016 primaries, I
would
used
be
to
different.
post rather snarky tweets about virtually all of the
Are you
candidates,
kidding me?
Republican
Whatever,
and
I don't
Democrat. And every so often, I'll still do some of that. I do think actually the amount of snark on my Twitter feed has gone down fairly significantly. I think if you go back a couple of years, it was probably a little more snarky. Today, I'm trying to use it a little
Snarky.
bit more in terms of strategy
Snarky.
to
No,
get out
sneaky.
information. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to make jokes about, for example, Joe Biden. I will make jokes about Joe Biden. He's the president of the United States. Nobody else will mock him. So the entire comedic establishment has decided they actually work for him.
So if the president of the United States, no matter who they are, get the snark.
Yes. And President Trump, I think, is fairly aware that he got the snark from me as well.
And if it's all bots,
When it comes to snarking the president, I'm not going to stop that. I think the
whoever
president
coded
deserves to be snarked.
y'all,
So you're not
I
afraid of attacking
suppose.
Trump?
I don't really know.
No, I mean,
Those are
I've
kind
done
of
it
cheap
before.
to use, I suppose.
Can you say what your favorite and least
I'm not
favorite
going to complain.
things are
Not
about
gonna
President
complain.
Trump and President Biden, one at a
Y'all are
time?
humans,
So
I'm not
maybe
going
one
off.
thing that you can say super positive
Speculating.
about Trump, and one
Why
thing
do I
super
do
negative
this?
about Trump.
Why do
Okay,
I
so
do
the super positive thing about Trump is that because he has no preconceived views that are establishmentarian, he's sometimes willing to go out of the box and do things that haven't been tried before. And sometimes that works. I mean, the best example being the entire foreign policy establishment telling him that he couldn't get a Middle Eastern deal done unless he centered the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and instead he just went right around that and ended up cutting a bunch of peace deals in the Middle East. Or moving the embassy in Jerusalem. Right? Sometimes it does stuff, and it's really out of the box, and it actually
Wait,
works. And that's kind of
Palestine,
awesome in politics
Israel?
and neat to see. The downside of Trump is that he has
Which I
no
don't
capacity
know enough about to say
to
anything.
use any sort of. There's no filter between brain
It's
and
too
mouth.
controversial. and I
Whatever
don't-
happens in his brain is the thing that comes out of his mouth. I know a lot of people find that charming and wonderful, and from time to, and it is very funny. But I don't think that it is a particularly excellent personal quality in a person who has as much responsibility as President Trump has. I think he says a lot of damaging and bad things on Twitter. I think that he seems consumed in some ways by his own grievances, which is why you've seen him focusing in on election 2020 so much. And I think that is very negative about President Trump. So I'm very grateful to President Trump as a conservative for many of the things that he did. I think that a lot of his personality issues are pretty severe.
What about Joe Biden?
So I think that the thing that I like most about Joe Biden, I will say that Biden, two things.
Joe
One,
Biden
seems to be a very good father.
Been holding it in.
By all available evidence, right? There are a lot of people who have put out, kind of tape of him talking to Hunter, and Hunter's having trouble with drugs or whatever. And I keep listening to that tape and thinking, he seems like a really good dad. Like the stuff that he's saying to his son is stuff that, God forbid, if that were happening with my kid, I'd be saying to my kid. And so, you can't help but feel for the guy. He's had an incredibly difficult go of it with his first wife and death of members of his family, and then Bo dying. I mean, like that kind of stuff obviously is deeply sympathetic in his
Child
his,
sniffer
yeah,
Ben.
he seems like a deeply sympathetic father. As far as his
Don't
politics,
act like you don't.
he seems like a slap on the back, kind of guy, and I don't mind that. I think that's nice so far as it goes. It's sort of an old school politics where things are done with handshake and personal relationships. The thing that I don't like about him is I think sometimes that's really not genuine. I think that sometimes, I think that's his personal tendency, but I think sometimes he allows the prevailing winds of his party to carry him to incredibly radical places, and then he just doubles down on the radicalism in some pretty disingenuous ways. And there I would cite the Independence Day speech, or the Independence Hall speech, which I thought was truly one of the worst speeches I've seen a president give.
So you don't think he's trying to be a unifier in general?
Not at all. I mean, that's what he was elected to do. He was elected to do two things: not be alive and be a unifier. Those were the two things. And when I say not be alive, I don't mean like physically dead. This is where the snark comes in. But what I do mean is that he was elected to not be particularly activist. Basically, the mandate was don't be Trump. Be sane. Don't be Trump. Calm everything down. And instead he got in and he's like, what if we spend $7 trillion? What if we pull out of Afghanistan without any sort of plan? What if I start labeling all of my political enemies of the Republic? What if I start bringing Dylan Mulvaney to the White House and talking about how it is a moral sin to prevent the genital mutilation of minors? I mean, like this kind of stuff is very radical stuff. And this is not a president who's pursued a unifying agenda, which is why his approval rating sank from 60% when he entered office to low 40s or high 30s today. Unlike President Trump, who never had a high approval rating, right? Trump came into office and he had like a 45% approval rating, and when he left office, he had about a 43% approval rating. He bounced around between 45 and 37 pretty much his entire presidency. Biden went from being a very popular guy coming in to a very unpopular guy right now, and if you're Joe Biden, you should be looking in the mirror and wondering exactly why.
Do you think that pulling out from Afghanistan could be flipped as a pro for Biden?
Dang it, I didn't mean to do that.
I think it's going to be almost impossible. I think the American people are incredibly inconsistent about their own views on foreign policy. In other words, we like to be isolationist until it comes time for us to
I don't want to attack you. I don't want to attack you. I don't want to attack you.
When that
No
happens, I
way.
tend not to like it very much.
You mentioned Biden being a
that's
good
what I get
father.
for being an idiot.
Can you make the case for and against the Hunter Biden laptop story, for it being a big deal and against it being a big deal?
Sure. So the case for it being a big deal is basically twofold. One is that it is clearly relevant
Wait, what
if
was the
the
laptop
president's
story
son
again? I can't
is running around to foreign countries picking up bags of cash because his last name is Biden while his father is vice president of the United States. And it raises questions as to influence peddling for either the vice president or the former vice president using political connections. Did he make any money? Who was the big guy, right? All these open questions that obviously implicates
What does
the
peddling mean?
questions to be asked. And then the secondary reason that the story is big is actually because of the reaction
have
to
an
the story.
idea.
The banning of the story is in and of itself a major story. If there's any story that implicates a presidential candidate in the last month of an election and there is a media blackout, including a social media blackout, that obviously raises some very serious questions about informational flow and dissemination in the United States.
So no matter how big of a deal the story is, it is a big deal that there's a censorship of any relevant story.
When there's a coordinated, collusive blackout, yeah, that's a serious and major problem. So those are the two reasons why it would be a big story. The two reasons, a reason why it would not be a big story is if it turns out, and we don't really know this yet, but let's say that Hunter Biden was basically off on his own doing what he was doing, you know, being a derelict or drug addict or acting badly, and his dad had nothing to do with it, and Joe was telling the truth, and he really knew. But the problem is, we
Wait,
never
what
actually
exactly
know those
does it mean to
questions
peddle
answered.
again?
So if it had turned out to be nothing of a story, the nice thing about stories that turn out to be nothing is that
actually
after they
asking.
turn out to be nothing, they're nothing. The biggest problem with this story is that it wasn't allowed to take the normal life cycle of a story, which is original story breaks, follow-on questions are asked, follow-on questions are answered. The story is either now a big story or into nothing. The life cycle of a story is cut off right at the very beginning, right when it's born, then that allows you to speculate in any direction you want. You can speculate. It means nothing. It's nonsense. It's a Russian laptop. It's disinformation. Or on the other hand, this means that Joe Biden was personally calling Hunter and telling him to pick up a stack of cash over in Beijing, and then he became president and he's influence peddling. So, this is why it's important to allow these stories to go forward. So this is why actually the bigger story for the moment is not the laptop, it's the reaction to the laptop, because it cut off that life cycle of the story. And then, at some point I would assume that there will be some follow-on questions that are actually answered. The House is pledging, if it goes Republican, to investigate all of this. Again, I wouldn't be supremely surprised if it turns out that there was no direct involvement of Joe in this sort of stuff, because it turns out, as I said before, that all of politics is V. And this is always the story with half the scandals that you see, is that everybody assumes that there's some sort of deep and abiding, clever plan that some politician is implementing it, and then you look at it and it turns out, no, it's just something dumb, right? This is sort of
I don't know
perfect
enough
example of
about
this,
it to have
President
anything
Trump
else
with the
to
classified
say.
documents in Mar-a-Lago. So people on the left, it's probably nuclear codes. Probably he's taking secret documents and selling them to the Russians and the Chinese.
But
And
if
the
anybody
real,
has any
most
opinion,
obvious explanation is Trump looked at the papers and he said, I like these papers, and then he just decided to keep them.
I kind of
Right, and then
tuned
people
out
came to him
for
and
the
said, Mr.
past
President, you're not
years.
allowed to keep those papers. He said, who are those people? I don't care about what they have
So,
to
like,
say.
I
I'm putting them
vaguely know
in the
about
other
what
room
he's
in a
talking
box."
about, but I don't know the
Like,
details.
which is it is highly likely that that is what happened, and it's very disappointing to people. I think when they realize that the human brain. I mean, you know this better than I do, but the human brain is built to find patterns. Right? It's what we like to do. We like to find plans
Don't
and
tell
patterns
me
because
about
this
the
is how we
brain,
survived in the
Shapiro.
wild. Because you found a plan, you found a pattern, you cracked the code of the universe. When it comes to politics,
He's
the
definitely
conspiracy theories that we see so often, it's largely because we're seeing inexplicable events. Unless you just assume everyone's a moron. If you assume that there's a lot of stupidity going on, everything becomes quickly explicable. If you assume that there must be some rationale behind it, you have to come up with increasingly convoluted conspiracy theories to explain just why people are acting the way that they're acting. And I find that, I won't say 100% of the time, but 94% of the time, the conspiracy theory turns out just to be people being dumb, and then other people
Oh,
reacting
is
in
that
dumb ways.
so,
to the original people.
Shapiro?
But it's also, to me, in that same way, very possible, very likely that the Hunter Biden
We
getting
wouldn't
money
wanna
in Ukraine,
accidentally
I guess,
be
for consulting
dumb.
and all that kind of stuff is a nothing burger. He's qualified, he's getting money as he should. There's a lot of
I know, right,
in
Ricardo?
general that's not
I think
corrupt.
I think
Like,
the most
fix
obvious
it.
explanation there probably is that he was fake influence peddling, meaning he went to Ukraine and he's like, guess what? My dad's Joe. And they're like, well, you don't have any qualifications in oil and natural gas, and you don't really have a great resume, but your dad is Joe. And then that was kind of the end of it. They gave him a bag of cash, hoping he would do something, and never did
I
anything.
think you're making it sound worse than it is. I think that in general, consulting is done in that way. Your name, it's not like you're.
I agree with you.
You're not. It's not like he is some rare case, and this is an illustration of corruption. If you can criticize consulting, which I would,
That's fair.
which they're basically
Well, I'm kind of a
not
dweeb too, so I
providing.
can't joke.
You look at a resume and who's who. Like if you went to Harvard, I can criticize the same thing. If you have Harvard on your resume, you're more likely to be hired as a consultant. Maybe there's a network there of people that you know, and you hire them in that same way. If your last name is Biden, there's a lot of last names that sound pretty good at a resume.
No, for sure.
And
for
so,
sure.
and it's
And
not
Hunter
like
Biden admitted that much, by the way, right? In an open interview, he was like, if your last name weren't Biden, wouldn't you got that job? And he's like, probably not. And,
yeah,
and
but
you're
that's
right.
an honest.
I agree with you.
It's not like he's getting a ridiculous amount of money. He was getting like a pretty standard consulting kind of money, which also would criticize because they get a ridiculous amount of money. But I
don't know
sort of
how
push
I
back
ended
on
up
the life cycle
getting
or to
myself
steel
into a
man
dungeon. I know how.
decide
All the dumb
that
people play
was
video games
concerned
to
about the
win.
Hunter Biden laptop story. I don't know
Thank
if
you,
there
Warp
is a
Shadows,
natural life cycle of a story.
for your words
Because
of
there's something about
encouragement.
the
I appreciate it.
virality of the internet that we can't predict, that a story can just take hold and the conspiracy around it builds, especially around politics, where the interpretation, some popular, sexy interpretation of a story that might not be connected to reality at all, will become viral. And that, from Facebook's perspective, is probably what they're worried about. Organized misinformation campaign that makes up a sexy story or sexy interpretation of
Sexy story.
the vague story that we have, and that has an influence on the populace.
I mean, I think that's true, but I think the question becomes who's the great adjudicator there, right? Who adjudicates when the story ought to be allowed to go through even
Wait,
a
what
bad
does
life
peddling
cycle,
mean again?
or maybe allowed to go viral, as opposed to not. Now, it's one thing if you want to say, okay, we can spot the Russian accounts that are actually promoting this stuff. They belong to the Russian government. Got to shut that down. I think everybody agrees. This is actually one of the slides that's happened linguistically that I really object to, is the slide between disinformation and misinformation. And you notice there's this evolution. And in 2017, there was a lot of talk about disinformation. It was Russian disinformation. The Russians were putting out deliberately false information in order to skew election results, was the accusation. And then people started using disinformation or misinformation. And misinformation is either mistaken information or information that is quote-unquote out of context. That becomes very subjective very quickly as to what out of context means. And it doesn't necessarily have to be from a foreign source. It can be from a domestic source, right? It could be somebody misinterpreting something here. It could be somebody interpreting something correctly, but PolitiFact thinks that it's out of context. And that sort of stuff gets very murky very quickly. And so I'm deeply uncomfortable with the idea that Facebook and Zuckerberg was on with Rogan and talking about how the FBI had basically said, look out for Russian interference in the election. And then all of these people were out there saying that the laptop was Russian disinformation, so he basically shut it down. That sort of stuff is frightening, especially because it wasn't Russian disinformation. I mean, the laptop was real. And so the fact that you have people who seem to, let's put it this way, it seems as though,
Oh dear.
this is wrong, it seems as though when a story gets killed preemptively like this, it is almost universally a story that negatively affects one side of the political aisle. I can't remember the last time there was a story on the right that was disinformation or misinformation, where social media stepped in and they went, we cannot have this, this cannot be distributed. We're going to all collude that this information is not distributed. Maybe in response to the story being proved false, it gets taken down. But what made the Hunter Biden thing so amazing is that it wasn't really even in response to anything. It was like the story got posted, there were no actual doubts expressed as to the verified falsity of the story. It was just supposition that it had to be false, and everybody jumped in. So I think that confirmed a lot of the conspiracy theories people had about social media and how it works.
Yeah, so if the reason you want to slow down the viral spread of a thing is at all grounded in partisanship, that's a problem. Like, you should be very honest with yourself and ask yourself that question. Is it because I'm on the left or on the right that I want to slow this down? Versus, is it hate? Bipartisan hate speech. Right. So but it's really tricky. But I like you, I'm very uncomfortable in general with any kind of slowing down, with any kind of censorship. But if there's something like a conspiracy theory that spreads hate, that becomes viral, I still lean to let that conspiracy theory spread, because the alternative is dangerous, more dangerous.
It's sort of like the ring of power, right? Like, everybody wants the ring, because with the ring you can stop the bad guys from going forward, but it turns out that the ring gives you enormous power, and that power can be used in the wrong ways too.
You had the Daily Wire, which I'm a member of.
I appreciate that, thank you.
I recommend everybody sign up to it. It should be part of your regular diet, whether you're on the left or the right, the far left or the far right. Everybody should be part of your regular diet. Okay, that said, do you worry about the audience capture aspect of it? Because it is a platform for conservatives, and you have a powerful voice on there. It might be difficult for you to go against the talking points or against the stream of ideas that is usually connected to conservative thought. Do you worry about that?
I mean, the audience would obviously be upset with me and would have a right to be upset with me if I suddenly flipped all of my positions on a dime. I have enough faith in my audience that I can say things that I think are true and that may disagree with the audience, on a fairly regular basis, I would say. But they understand that on the deeper principle, we're on the same side of the, at least I hope that much, from the audience. It's also why we provide a number of different views on the platforms, many of which I disagree with, but are sort of within the generalized range of conservative thought. That it's something I do have to think about every day, though. Yeah, I mean, you have to think about, like, am I saying this because I'm afraid of taking off my audience, or am I saying this because I actually believe this? And
I interrupted him.
That's a delicate dance a little bit. You have to be sort of honest with yourself.
Yeah, somebody like Sam Harris is pretty good at this.
Look how low my DPS is.
Saying the most outrageous thing that he knows. He almost leads into it. He knows will piss off a lot of his audience. Sometimes you almost have to test the system. It's like, if you feel, you almost exaggerate your feelings just to make sure to send a signal to the audience that you're not captured by them. So speaking of people you disagree with, what is your favorite thing about Candace Owens? And what is one thing you disagree with her on?
Well, my favorite thing about Candace is that she will say things that nobody else will say. My least favorite thing about Candace is that she will say things that nobody else will say. I mean, listen, she says things that are audacious and I think need to be said sometimes. Sometimes I think that she is morally wrong. Right? I think the way she responded to Kanye, I've said this clearly, was dead wrong and morally wrong.
What was her response?
Her original response was that she proffered confusion of what Ye was actually talking about. And then she, was defending her friend. I wish that the way that she had responded was by saying, he's my friend, and also he said something bad and anti-Semitic. I wish that she had said that. So
Right away.
Yeah.
I think you can also, this is the interesting human thing. You can be friends with people that you disagree with, and you can be friends with people that actually say hateful stuff. And one of the ways to help alleviate hate is being friends with people that say hateful things.
Yeah, and then calling them out on a personal level when they do say wrong or hateful things.
Yeah, from a place of love and respect, and privately.
Privately is also
very
a good thing,
good.
right? I mean, like the public demand for
from a place of love and
denunciation
respect.
from friends to friends.
Yeah, but
is,
I'm right.
Is difficult and I certainly have compassion for Candace, given the fact that she's so close with the icon.
Yeah, it breaks my heart sometimes. The public fights
right.
between friends and broken friendships. I've seen quite a few friendships.
We agree with you. We're
publicly
inclined to agree
break
with you
over
on those
COVID.
things.
COVID made people behave their worst in many cases.
No, I joke, but I'm just as bad.
Yeah, it breaks my heart
Not
a little
really.
bit. Because like the human connection is a prerequisite for effective debate
I don't
and
know,
discussion
Candace.
and battles
I don't
over
know.
ideas.
I don't know who they're talking
Has there
about.
been any argument from the opposite political aisle that has made you change your mind? If you look back,
So, I will say that I'm thinking it through because I think that my views probably on foreign policy have morphed somewhat. I would say that I was much more interventionist when I was younger. I'm significantly less interventionist now. I'd
can
probably
you give
put
an
myself.
example?
Sure. I was a big backer of the Iraq War. I think now, in retrospect, I might not be a backer of the Iraq War if the same situation arose again, based on the amount of evidence that had been presented, or based on the sort of willingness of the American public to go. But if you're going to get involved in a war, you have to know
Vampire
what the
Frog,
endpoint looks like, and you have to know what the American people really are willing to
Take a
bear, and the
time
American
out.
people are not willing to bear open-ended
Can you behave yourself?
occupations. And so, knowing that, you have to
Why?
consider that going in.
Why the need
So, on foreign policy, I've become a lot more of a almost Henry
to
Kissinger realist in some ways.
infiltrate the
when it
chat
comes
with
to
images of male genitalia?
social policy, I would say that I'm fairly strong where I was. I may have become slightly convinced actually by more of the conservative side of the aisle on things like drug legalization. I think when I was younger, I was much more pro-drug legalization than I am now, at least on the local level. On a federal level, I think the federal government can't really do much other than close the borders with regard to fentanyl trafficking, for example. But
What are you
when it comes to
talking
how
about,
drugs ruin local communities, you can see how drugs ruin local communities pretty easily.
Which is weird because I saw you smoke a joint right before this conversation.
It's my biggest thing. I mean, I try to keep that secret.
All right. Well, that's interesting about intervention. Can you comment about the war in Ukraine? So for me, it's a deeply personal thing, but I think you're able to look at it from a geopolitics perspective. What is the role of the United States in this conflict, before the conflict, during the conflict, and right now in helping achieve peace?
I think before the conflict, the big problem is that the West took almost the worst possible view, which was encourage Ukraine to keep trying to join NATO and the EU, but don't let them in. And so what that does is it achieves the purpose of getting Russia really, really, really ticked off and feeling threatened, but also does not give any of the protections of NATO or the EU to Ukraine. I mean, Zelensky is on film when he was a comedy actor making that exact joke, right? Like, he has Merkel on the other line, and she's like, "Oh, welcome to NATO," and he's like, "Great." She's like, "Wait, is this Ukraine on the line?" And oops. But so that sort of policy is sort of nonsensical. If you're going to offer alliance to somebody, offer alliance to them, and if you're going to guarantee their security, guarantee their security. And the West failed signally to do that. So that was mistakes in the run-up to the war. Once the war began, then the responsibility of the West became to give Ukraine as much material as is necessary to repel the invasion. And the West did really well with that. I think we were late on the ball in the United States. It seemed like Europe led the way a little bit more than the United States did there. But in terms of effectuating American interests in the region, which being an American is what I'm chiefly concerned about, the American interests were severalfold. One is preserve borders. Two is degrade the Russian aggressive military, because Russia's military has been aggressive, and they are a geopolitical rival of the United States. Three, recalibrate the European balance with China. Europe was sort of balancing with Russia and China, and then because of the war, they sort of rebalanced away from China and Russia, which is a real geostrategic opportunity for the United States. It seemed like most of those goals have already been achieved at this point for the United States. And so then the question becomes, what's the off-ramp here? And what is the thing you're trying to prevent? So what's the best opportunity? What's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? And then what's realistic? So best case scenario is Ukraine forces Russia entirely out of Ukraine, including Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea, right? That's the best case scenario. Virtually no one thinks that's accomplishable, including the United States, right? The White House has basically said as much. It's difficult to imagine, particularly Crimea, the Russians being forced out of Crimea. The Ukrainians have been successful in pushing the Russians out of certain parts of Luhansk and Donetsk, but the idea they're going to be able to push the entire Russian army completely back to the Russian borders that would be at best a very, very long and difficult slog in the middle of a collapsing Ukrainian economy, which is a point that Zelensky has made. It's like, it's not enough for you guys to give us military aid. We're in the middle of a war. We're going to need economic aid as well. So it's a pretty open-ended and strong commitment.
Can I take a small tangent on that?
Sure.
Best case scenario, if that does militarily happen, including Crimea, do you think there's a world in which Vladimir Putin would be able to convince the Russian people that this was a good conclusion to the war?
Right. So the problem is that the best case scenario might also be the worst case scenario, meaning that there are a couple of scenarios that are sort of the worst case scenario, and this is